Hey, folks, thanks so much for joining us here on this breaking news alert coming out of Warren County in regards to Stephen Lawson's trial in the disappearance of Crystal Rogers. I'm Myra Ansari with my coworker and friend here, Jose Zozaya. Steve Lawson has been found guilty today on both of those charges that he was facing. Jose, it did not take the jury very long today to come up with a verdict.
No, it didn't, Myra. For the folks at home, just so you know, we've been following this, as you can imagine, so closely. The earliest that we could have had the jury come up with a verdict on a decision on this, we were being told, was 1:30. So factor, it wasn't the quickest turnaround for their decision on a verdict, but it's been 2.5 hours. Obviously, our team staying there in the Warren County courtroom to follow the latest, waiting to come back in, see what the jury had to say. Perhaps not the biggest surprise, especially if you factor in, Myra. I want to read you sort of our key notes on the prosecution and the defense's closing arguments, if you mind if I read those to you.
Yeah, go ahead.
So the defense going first in a case like this, the points they were making are, and I'm going to read the back here. So the defense was trying to make the point to the jury in Steve Lawson's case that the evidence that they presented fell short. You presume you have to get to a point where it's beyond a reasonable doubt that all the charges that were filed against Steve Lawson, and that is what actually happened. So his defense attorney trying to make the case the evidence was falling short. In particular, they were pointing to a lack of tests done, the DNA tests done on the hair, the possibility that there might have been someone else inside of that car before either he or his son, Joseph Lawson, came in to use it. The fact that the investigation's not over, they've mentioned now the terms of the, quote, unindicted co-conspirators, which gets into layers for the next trial involving Brooks Houck and Joseph Lawson. So you have that element there. But the quote they wanted to drive home was, if they, being the prosecutors, didn't bring something in as evidence, quote, it is not evidence. So they whatever they didn't have put before them, they couldn't fill those gaps in. And the last statement they made based on our team there in the courtroom, there's no proof there was a murder or an agreement to commit a murder. That gets into the debate between a conspiracy or the facilitation, which was a discussion about the terminology of Steve Lawson's role or implication in all of this. So you hear the defense go that route. The prosecutor gets the last say. And based on the notes we were able to get from inside court, the point they were driving to make was that Steve Lawson knew the plan was to, quote, kill that young lady, meaning kill Crystal Rogers, and that they wanted the jury to feel like Steve Lawson knew that and still chose to play a part in it. Quote, he's lying to cover up his fundamental role in this conspiracy. That is the word that they kept repeating. It is a conspiracy. And a pretty staggering comparison here, Myra. One of the final metaphors that the prosecutors used, they called Steve Lawson Judas, because there was a bit of evidence and testimony brought up that there was some kind of deal that he and Brooks Houck had made after this was all said and done, that he would be promised all the drywall work. And let's see if we can bring in.
Yeah, we're going to actually
sub in.
Leland,
Yes.
Leland, come on in. Our legal expert, Leland Hulbert, is here just in time.
I can defer to the seat if you
want.
Leland.
Hi, Leland. Thank you for jumping in right now. Kind of give us your reaction to today's verdict by the jury. We can go over there. Today's verdict, guilty on both charges.
So I just heard, and I think it was guilty of the conspiracy murder, which is a Class B felony, and then the tampering, which is a Class D. So basically tells me that the jury did not believe the defendant. It's a risk to put your client on, and whether that was a calculated decision by the defense team or whether the client was begging to testify, we won't know. But clearly it did not work. And then I just found out, Jim Lasowski gave the closing. He's one of the best prosecutors probably in the history of Kentucky. And so I guarantee you he did a good job and tied everything together and made the confusing more simple. And the jury has spoken. They believe that this man was clearly involved in the scheme and helped plan this. It wasn't just he drove a car.
So in throughout the trial, we heard the defense admit, like, we admit that he lied. We admit that he played a part in the tampering with physical evidence part. But they were saying he wasn't involved in the murder. So they kind of already had admitted, like, okay, our client is in this picture for sure. So do you think that played a role in the jury kind of being like, all right, we know where this is heading?
Not necessarily. I don't. Again, not knowing everything that the defense decided to do, the strategy of saying he tampered is not the worst strategy in the world, because they had that jail call. The jail call to me was like, well, mom moved the car. I shouldn't have moved the car. Well, okay, you tampered. You fall on that sword because, you tend to try to argue what you can dispute and agree with what you can't dispute. And so they couldn't dispute the moving of the car. But the murder itself, getting these bits and pieces of the trial, it seemed somewhat convoluted, but clearly the jury unanimously and pretty quickly decided that he was guilty.
I want to show folks, this is a live look from the outside the Warren County Courthouse. Alina Noakes, we're waiting for her to come out to give us a little bit more information. She's been in that courtroom. Our cameras are outside because they cannot be inside the courtroom. Now, the big question, Leland, is that we still have to get to the trial for Brooks Houck and also Joseph Lawson. This guilty verdict today, what does that set the stage for the next trial that's coming up?
Well, I would assume the defense attorneys for Brooks Houck and Joseph Lawson were hoping for a not guilty.
Sure.
Because that would weaken everything, and perhaps offers would be better. Perhaps the likelihood of success would be worse for the prosecutor. But I would think this would buoy the prosecution. I would think this would make Brooks Houck and Mr. Lawson, I don't want to say nervous, but they're different cases, different lawyers, different facts, and a different jury.
Mm-hmm.
But now Bowling Green is aware of this case, if maybe they were not before. So I would think that potential jurors are paying attention to this because it's a large, high-profile case. And so to find a jury in a few weeks that doesn't know anything about it, it's going to be a challenge.
That's going to be hard.
And even if they say, well, I don't really know much about it, they may still know there was a guilty verdict. Obviously, I don't think the judge will allow that to be mentioned in the second trial, that Stephen Lawson was found guilty, unless there's some rabbit out of the hat we don't know about where Stephen Lawson now gets another deal and says, now that you're guilty and facing at least 20 plus years in prison, do you want to tell us where the body is? Do you want to tell us how Brooks Houck was involved, if he was?
Would we likely see in the upcoming trial for Brooks and Joseph, Steve testifying against these two, or making a deal to come up with something in order to testify?
I mean, the prosecutors are carrying all the cards now because Stephen is guilty. So I don't know. I don't know if they've gone through the full process of a trial. Stephen's had 10 years to make a deal, and he hasn't.
Okay.
So that's speculation. I'm sure it will be announced if he testifies, or if he's given a deal. But then, of course, the defense attorney can hammer him for saying, well, you're lying now. You've had nothing to lose. You were going to prison. So, but it depends. I mean, the big thing in these cases is the family wants to know what really happened.
Yeah.
And we still don't know.
We still don't know. That's a huge thing. We saw Crystal's mother, Sherry Ballard, exit the courtroom today when things got really hard for her. Very emotional, very understandable, having to go through the pain for the past 10 years. And then you're hearing things from a different perspective today in the courtroom. You've been in countless courtrooms. This is a hard thing for families and loved ones to go through.
Right. There's a sense of relief. There can be some brief joy, but it's usually just sadness, and it's always sadness. And the justification of finding someone guilty who you believe murdered your daughter, it's there and it's present. And today is a better day for that family than yesterday. But at the same time, it's still a painful reminder that you've lost a child.
Yeah. I always tell the story. I remember when we got the phone calls in the newsroom. I used to work weekend mornings when loved ones of Crystal Rogers had called our newsroom. I answered that phone call when they were in that frantic search trying to find her. And I think at the beginning, everybody thought, oh, she'll turn up, you know.
Right.
And to go 10 years with nothing, you don't know what happened, really. You don't know where her body is. That is beyond excruciating for anyone to have to deal with that.
Right. And, there would be, I assume, some incentive by the prosecutor if anybody wanted to finally say, this is actually what happened. This is what we did with the body. This is why you haven't found a body. But to my knowledge, there's been a lot of statements and I don't know them all. I don't think that information's come out. So if these people did this crime, they know, and they could potentially bargain that information. But we're getting late in the day, and all of a sudden now you have a big check mark in the prosecution side of the case. And I think the defense is going to be a little worried for the next trial, would be my guess.
I think one of the biggest losses or heartbreaking things that could come out of this is to never know what happened to her.
Right.
Yeah. All right. I'm going to step aside. My co-anchor, Jose Zozaya, is going to step in and continue the conversation with Leland.
I appreciate that, Myra. Thank you. Just plugging in right here. Again, thank you all for staying tuned in as we're breaking down the latest information. Again, a jury finding Stephen Lawson guilty of both counts. Appreciate, of course, all the extensive insight from our legal analyst, Leland Hulbert, as I get myself situated here, Leland. Thank you. So, question for you. I don't know if Myra's already touched on this as we're just getting all this breaking down now. At all surprised based on the time it took the jury to come to this decision. Remember, you and I were discussing just yesterday at night. It's a Friday. We presumed that both sides would approach their closing arguments. We were told the earliest might be, 1:30 could have been the earliest that they were going to talk. But here we are at this time, 4:17. Were you at all surprised that they came back to this decision relatively quickly?
Yes. From what I understand and reading the notes from today is that the jury was offered a lesser included offense of facilitation to murder, which is basically saying, you're helping, the driver of the getaway car, but he didn't actually rob the bank or that kind of thing. Something where he helped or did things to facilitate, but didn't actually participate. And I thought that's kind of where it would fall. I thought the jury might split the baby and say, well, we're not going to give him on conspiracy to murder, but it sounds like facilitation, which is kind of close to tampering, and it's a much lower felony. But to slam him on the conspiracy, that's a Class B felony, 10 to 20 years in prison, and it's serious. I mean, they believed everything the prosecutors were saying, and to have a 10-year-old bodiless murder case solved in 2 to 3 hours by the jury or deliberated for only 2 to 3 hours, that's a pretty strong message that they did believe what the prosecutors were saying.
Is it worth staying on that nuance between conspiracy and facilitation, which sounds like, they were adding this as sort of instructions to the jury just today for the folks at home. Is it worth, really parsing that difference between facilitation and conspiracy?
Maybe not now because they found the bigger one. And the conspiracy has to do more with believing that Stephen Lawson was actually involved in helping plan this murder and not just moving a car. And at the end of the day, I think that's what they believed, that he helped plan this or he was involved in this plan. And hearing some bits and pieces from the closing, that's what it sounds like the prosecutor hammered on as well. And, whenever I've seen a defendant testify, if a jury doesn't like that defendant or doesn't believe that defendant, it's a huge hill for them to climb to overcome that, because the right to remain silent can be pretty powerful. And you've seen plenty of high-profile cases where they did not testify.
Real quick here, Leland, I want to show you, this is our camera from inside the courthouse. I guess we presume this was the courtroom itself when they were holding the trial. And this brings me to a question, perhaps a theme for those of you who've been tuning in with us on Wave Extra in the evenings throughout the week. Leland, we've been discussing, at least once each night, the possibility of Steve Lawson taking the stand. Lo and behold, he did.
Well, he proved me wrong. I didn't say that he wouldn't, but I think I was about 100 to 1. I just assumed he would not. Now, again, I'm not privy to all the evidence or all the arguments or all the trial footage, but typically you don't want your client testifying because you never know where it's going to go. And usually it happens because, one, your client thinks he's innocent. Two, your client demands it. Again, at the end of the day, you're just a lawyer. Your client gets to do theoretically what they want to do. You can only advise them. Or three was a defense strategy, saying we believe our client, we believe he can tie up some of these loose ends, and he'll come off like an intelligent, competent witness.
Mm-hmm.
And whether or not he did, he may still have, and the jury just thought the evidence was overwhelming. But from a third party looking at it, I didn't know if the evidence was enough to convict him, and clearly the jury thought it was.
Interesting you say that, Leland, because I see some notes that I'd taken down, and it's the stuff from our reporting team in the courtroom looking at how the defense wanted to close, how the prosecutors wanted to close. It seems Mr. Lawson's defense team was really trying to hammer the point home. They thought the evidence was falling short. If they were to keep trying to circle that loop of the hairs that went untested, the possibility that someone else had been in that car before either he or his son had used it, the question about a social security check that no one bothered to follow up on, hinting at their claim that Crystal Rogers might be still alive, or no proof that she was ever killed. And they did not seem to regret bringing Steve Lawson on the stand. The quote we have there is an honest, heartfelt rendition of what he says happened. So you might argue, it seems they were taking this approach that they had nothing to lose at that point.
So yeah, shining a spotlight on the problems that the prosecution had is what you're supposed to do. But at the same time, clearly there was a relationship. Clearly Lawson knew Houck and knows his son. And there were some issues with Crystal Rogers' car. So Stephen Lawson was never going to go out there and say, I didn't know these people. And I think the way he sort of acted today was, well, I knew this, but I didn't know that. And the jury's probably like, that doesn't make sense. That could be what the jury was thinking, is that, you can't just take responsibility for the little things and ignore the big things, because there's other evidence that suggests you were part of this. And that's what the conspiracy is. So, where it goes from here, I mean, a second trial for co-defendants, I believe, is June 24th. That's pretty fast. Normally you see trials 6 months apart, 8 months apart, some offers, some new evidence, some things like that. But, the judge, probably because he had to move this to Bowling Green and everyone has to travel to do this case, they're trying to do it efficiently. And I would expect that trial to start on June 24th, barring something you'll hear about very soon. If there's motions filed by the defense attorneys for the other two, you'll hear something pretty soon if they believe that should be continued. But it sounds like this judge wants to push it forward and get this done.
Okay. Thanks again to our Wave legal analyst, Leland Holbert, checking in with us. Of course, that breaking news, the jury finding Stephen Lawson guilty on the tampering charge and the conspiracy charge to commit murder. I know a producing team letting us know, Leland will continue the conversation with Dawn at 4:30. We're looking at the clock here. It's at 4:23. Just want to give you some time to go get situated, Leland. So appreciate your breakdown. We're going to take a very quick commercial break, and we'll be right back. Stay with us. All right, folks, thanks for checking back in with us. Coming up on 426 on this Friday evening, I'm Wave News anchor Jose Sosaya. You've probably tuned in with us as we were providing that late-breaking coverage thanks to anchor Myra Ansari and our Wave legal analyst Leland Hulbert. All this to say, we now have that breaking news coming in as we've been following Stephen Lawson's trial and his role in Crystal Rogers disappearing. The jury today, after about roughly 2.5 hours, coming to the conclusion that he was guilty on both of those counts, those 2 counts being tampering. So that would be tampering with evidence, again, connected to his role, prosecutors pointed out, with manipulating evidence and moving things around in Crystal Rogers' car. And the second one was conspiracy to commit murder, so implying the point that he did at least have that knowledge that something or someone was trying to plan to harm Crystal Rogers. So again, a lot to break down. Still early in the afternoon as we're going through the latest information. Right now, what I want to show you is the inside of the Warren County Courthouse. We presume this is that very courtroom that everyone filed into throughout this week, not just loved ones, people who knew Crystal Rogers, presumably other people who have a relationship with so many of the different characters involved in this particular story. I do want to point out a note from our reporting team there who's been there all week in Bowling Green. When the verdict came down on both of the charges, guilty charges on both sides, the Ballard family were told they just could not hold back the tears and started crying immediately. You could hear Crystal Rogers' mom, Sherry Ballard, crying as soon as that was said and confirmed by the jury. The feeling is that they were at least satisfied with the verdict that the jury rendered. You're still seeing several people coming in and out of the courtroom, and there's our crew setting that up right now. Of course, you could follow all the latest coverage. We've got live on Wave News at 4:30, regular Wave News at 4:30. Right now, we're streaming on most of our social platforms and on our Wave Now platform, which, reminder, you can download on your preferred app store with your smart TV. Let's see if we can go back to this footage from more people exiting the Warren County courtroom, where we know was the trial where certain individuals, I think right now we can see Sherry, that is Till Ballard, I believe we're seeing there is the grandfather of Crystal Rogers and some family members coming out of the courtroom. Images coming to you live from our team. You can see the emotion overflowing, presumably, so many lives and still so much heartbreak nearly 10 years after initially losing Crystal, presumably because she disappeared. No one has found her or confirmed that she's ever been found, that her body has ever been discovered. You can see just the outpouring of emotion, people filing out there from the courtroom. Alina Noakes has been doing an excellent job just following all the intricacies of the relationships and the different bits of testimony we've been hearing throughout the week. I do want to go ahead and just give you some highlights to what we were hearing this morning and into the afternoon. So we'll play that part. I just want to show that to you all. So in essence, I'm going to break down the key points we heard in court on this Friday. So the defense, which was a surprise if you've tuned in to Wave Extra with my conversations with Leland Hulbert, our legal analyst, we weren't presuming at all. We honestly thought the odds were really low that the defense would call Stephen Lawson to the stand, but we were proven wrong. He did take the stand. The notes we have from our reporting team is that when he came up to the stand, he was calm and collected. The defense strategy seemingly trying to humanize him as much as they could. A lot of the questions they talked about with Stephen Lawson were his relationship with his son, Joseph. He responded as a dad would if you're talking about a relationship that's been strained, obviously, in the reporting we've discovered. Stephen Lawson saying, quote, "I always love my son. I don't always like him, but I'll always love him." Now, Lawson went on to talk about that he was confused about some testimony we heard earlier this week from Elizabeth Chesser. So she has a child with Joseph Lawson, and it's part of her relationship with Steve. While he didn't want to address specifics, Steve Lawson said he'd always thought those two had a good relationship, so he was a little startled when she came to take the witness stand. Bringing him back to July 2015, he said he was with his son and with Brooks Hauk when the conversation of Crystal Rogers' car did come up. And so that was worth pointing out. as we move through more of our elements. Excuse me, as we're kind of checking some elements here. So a question and a quote came up about Steve Lawson with the car, and Steve Lawson says Brooks asked him about moving the car, and Lawson replied, quote, "Yes, sir, I will." Now, there's also a lot of mentions about a location called Thompson Hill Road, and why, in this case, Steve Lawson had been there for hours on end. He described himself as a, quote, raging drunk. So pointing to perhaps, his issues with alcohol abuse. A juror, in fact, asked him how much he drank when it came time for the jury to ask questions that they might have had lingering. Steve Lawson apparently discussing. He himself said he probably, quote, had half a gallon a day of alcohol. And there's more that they got into when it comes to the subject of doing something to Crystal Rogers' car. And that location in particular, Lawson on the stand said things had a habit of disappearing when they go past a certain point on that ridge that is the Thompson Hill Road, or at least a ridge that they were discussing. But he did not want the Thompsons, who we presume are the property owners where he would go to have these drinks, he didn't want them involved in any kind of crime. And his implication, there was a, quote, chop shop past that point on the ridge. So a lot of discussions for you there. When asked about what he meant, we have live pictures coming in. Excellent. I'm going to play a note here from our team as we're able to transfer that to you. That is our reporter, Alina Noakes, standing by. As you can see, she's getting ready to report on the latest bit of information there. Let's see if we can be able to take her when she comes up. But we'll have that ready for you to listen to once we get a A-OK from her. So we'll go ahead and put this back. Okay. Heading into when the prosecution was cross-examining Steve Lawson, there was a discussion of that he being Brooks Hauk asked Lawson to move the car, and that Lawson never asked why or where that had to happen. Lawson replied, "No, was I supposed to?" The prosecution then asks, "You say he got the wrong man because he wanted her murdered?" He didn't say that. "I thought deceased." He did not say that. So the prosecution then turns it. All right, let me take you now to our reporter, Alina Lawson, live there in Bowling Green really quick.
Tampering with evidence. Right now, the jury is deliberating over a sentence they want to return in this verdict. Now, the defense and both the prosecution and the defense have both made their arguments as to what they would like to see in this case. The defense saying that they would like to see 10 years, that would be total, which would be 1 year for tampering with evidence and the minimum of 10 years for conspiracy. The 10 years and the one running concurrently, meaning at the same time. Meanwhile, the prosecution coming up and making an emphatic plea to the jury, saying that they would like them to not tender any mercy in this case. I'm going to give you some context here, seeing that we don't have a camera in the courtroom, and it's that what we saw in court was an incredibly emotional Ballard family. One family member remarking right as we were leaving the courtroom, as the jury went back for deliberations, that this is the justice that they've been fighting for. As you can imagine, Sherry Ballard just in tears, really a mess, and they had to actually take a private room, the whole Ballard family, as the jury went into deliberations. But the prosecution team themselves, I've covered a lot of murder trials, a lot of big trials, and I've never seen a prosecution team just fall apart when they heard that verdict. John Snow, the detective who was the first detective investigating this case, when that call came in from the Ballard family that Crystal Rogers was missing, just in tears in the courtroom as we were all leaving while the jury went back for deliberation. So an emotional scene. Again, the prosecution asking for the maximum in this case, which would be 25 years. That would be 20 years as the maximum on conspiracy and 5 years on tampering with evidence, both of the 20 and the 5 running consecutively. He would have to serve 85% of that sentence. We're going to have more once the jury returns a recommended sentence in this case. But for now, Dawn, I'll toss it back to you and Leland.
All right, our thanks to our Alina Noakes reporting live from Bowling Green. As you can imagine, just the sheer waves of emotion that came from the entire Ballard family, the Ballard clan, and those who were involved in trying to find justice for her when this investigation, got started in July of 2015. It feels, as long as it has been for them, but the wounds are still fresh based on what we're hearing from the prosecution's reaction and everyone inside of the courtroom when that verdict was given. Again, Stephen Lawson found guilty on 2 charges of tampering with evidence and conspiracy to commit murder in the disappearance and presumed murder of Crystal Rogers. Again, a recap of how the defense and the prosecution decided to close today before the jury then went to deliberate. The defense trying to reiterate that some of the evidence was falling short because that falls on the prosecution to deliver the evidence and show that Stephen Lawson in this case was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. But they also wanted to hammer on the point of planning a murder. Quote, that's the most important part, the most important language. You did not hear that because that's not what happened. At least that was the defense's argument in trying to save Stephen Lawson, or, convince the jury that Stephen Lawson was not guilty of that particular charge. Another quote from the defense, representing Lawson: if they, meaning the prosecution, didn't bring something in here as evidence, it's not evidence. That is a direct quote from the defense in that matter. And they also called Lawson's testimony, which again was a surprise to most of us, at least in the discussion you've tuned in with us on Wave Extra, with my conversations with Leland Hulbert, our Wave legal analyst, that, what merit was there to have to bring on Stephen Lawson onto the stand? What benefits would we get from that particular addition there? Let's see if we can add some more things. I'm trying to refresh here as we're trying to get way more information for you at the top or at the middle half of this hour. But in essence, coming back here, prosecutors, that when they closed, they're saying he, being Steve Lawson, knew the plan was to kill that young lady, referring to Crystal, and that he knew that and chose to carry out his role in all of it. Quote, he's lying to cover up his fundamental role in this conspiracy. They really hammered on that point home, a conspiracy to kill Crystal. And the metaphor that the prosecution used, comparing Lawson's role to Judas because of a presumed deal in exchange for the favor, having helped out in this manner, to then with Brooks House's contracting businesses to have provided Steve Lawson the ability to do all the drywall work. The phrase that the prosecutors used, that was his quote, 30 pieces of silver for agreeing to do what he apparently did. So we'll bring it back here into our studio. That is our team there, ready to hear what the sentence might be. So we'll bring you back here in studio. And as we get you more information, we're going to take a very quick break, bring you right back here to Wave Now, our Wave socials. We'll see you in a bit. All right, folks, welcome back into Wave Now and all of our coverage on our social media. The breaking news, of course, Stephen Lawson's trial, and the verdict from the jury, guilty on both counts, tampering with evidence and conspiracy to commit murder in the disappearance of Crystal Rogers. Again, thanks for joining us throughout the week in all of our different coverage options. I'm your anchor, Jose Sosaya, providing and leading this particular segment of Wave Now and Wave Extra. Right now, we're working to see if I can get our reporter on the scene in Bowling Green, Alina Noakes, and part of our team there as she's able to give us the latest from inside of the courtroom. Let's see. We're getting some feedback, and then when we'll have to go back inside, we're going to have to let Alina go. So I'm going to see if I can bring her up now. I'm going to bring up the router. Alina, if you can hear me, I don't know if you're plugged in yet. Can you?
Yeah, Jose, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thanks for joining us right now. I just didn't want to take up too much of your time. For the folks tuning in on Wave Now and all the social feeds, you getting us this vital bit of information as soon as it came out of the courtroom. We heard the jury agree Steve Lawson guilty on both of these counts. Walk us through, everything you were paying attention to today, what sort of stood out to you, and obviously everything since we've heard this, verdict and the reaction to it, if we can bring you up on that.
Well, honestly, there's a lot to unpack with today and what we heard, obviously, from the beginning of the day, the defense wrapping up its case to start our morning. In fact, the surprise for a lot of people, as is usually the case when you're dealing with a presumed murder in this case, but a murder nonetheless, that a suspect would take the stand. In this case, Stephen Lawson did to begin his defense this morning. We also heard from his mom this morning, but Stephen Lawson trying to fess up to things that he said he was involved in when Crystal Rogers disappeared 10 years ago on July 3rd into July 4th of 2015. The jury didn't seem to believe him in this case because his attorneys were obviously asking for a lesser charge of facilitation, and instead the jury did find him guilty on conspiracy to commit murder, meaning that they believe that, regardless of the admissions he made about his actions that night in helping his son, picking his son up from a car, from Crystal Rogers' car, and having been asked or told by Brooks Houck that he would like to see, to him to take care of this girl, and he thought that meant that, he wanted her deceased. They didn't believe that he was just making admissions and didn't know that there was no plan at all. So obviously, in finding him guilty on this conspiracy charge, they simply didn't believe that. The defense was saying, clearly that's the case today. When they heard this guilty verdict come back, he said, Darren Wolf, the defense attorney in this case, saying that you obviously saw something in the facts that I didn't see. And so now they are taking the time to deliberate about what should be the sentencing in this case. And that's kind of where we're at right now. We're waiting to see what they're going to return with. I'll tell you the maximum is 25 years on both charges. The minimum is 10 years. As you can imagine, the defense asking for the minimum and the prosecution asking for the maximum. And we heard two very different pleas from these attorneys in this case. The defense saying they respect their verdict, the jury's verdict, but asking for them to tender mercy in this case, basically using his admissions as, he stepped forward. Stephen Lawson himself saying that he wasn't a man back then, but he's a man now, and that's why he's taking the stand in his defense and fessing up to his actions. But the prosecution saying that he's not a man at all, that if he would have been a man, he would have recognized the pleas of the Ballard family over the last decade and have come forward to say his involvement that night way earlier than today. So obviously two very different places here. I do want to note that we did hear from Crystal Rogers' daughter, Tori. She was 11 when her mother went missing in 2015. She is now 21 years old. Just incredibly emotional testimony to the jury this afternoon, trying to, get them to sentence him to the maximum in this case, saying that she's going to get married here very soon and her mother won't be there, and just describing how hard this has been on their family. And, when asked when did she finally give up hope that Crystal would ever be found, she said, we haven't given up hope. We think we're still going to find her. It just may not be in the way that we want to. So as you can imagine, this courtroom, just very emotional. Family, has not stopped crying since they heard that first guilty verdict read out by the judge today.
To your point, Alina, and for sure, you can't help but notice that we did see, I believe, Tommy Ballard's father, correct me if I'm wrong, Till Ballard, our camera was able to catch him able to leave the courtroom in tears. And that's just one representation of how much this is still weighing on all the families. If you could take us back inside the courtroom when both sides were delivering their closing arguments. I know you were there to listen to that. Some of the language in the notes you had sent us back, I guess, to understate it, speaks to the emotional nature of all of this. You know, the defense obviously going first, the prosecutors then coming after. There was a metaphor I'd love if you could expand with the prosecution, really strong language against Steve Lawson. Walk us through what the environment, what the sense was inside the courtroom there.
Absolutely. I'm going to reference some of my notes because this just happened, and I'd like to read you some direct quotes. We work very fast when we're dealing with situations like this. Actually, I'm going to have to let you go, Jose. We will get to those notes soon, but it does look like we have a sentence that has come in now, sentencing recommendation. So I'm going to let you go. We'll tune back in later, okay?
No worries. Thank you, Alina. Alina Noakes there in Bowling Green for us. Alina will provide us that latest information on the sentences. Thank you, Alina. And we'll let Alina go there. Okay, so as you can imagine, reemphasizing just how emotional the stakes are. Now we'll see what the reaction will be to this part of today's events and decisions, because it's going to be the sentencing part. You heard Alina Noakes breaking down for us what the minimums and the maximum on the ranges are for these particular charges. So you were hearing in both cases, the charge for tampering and the charge for conspiracy, the minimum would be 10 years, which is what the defense is pleading on behalf of their client, Steve Lawson. The maximum, presumably what the prosecution is seeking, it would be 25 years. So stack that, you're talking about a minimum range, 20 years in prison, and then the 85% served, allowing a window, presumably then for Steve Lawson to be able to leave custody. On the long end of that range, you're talking 50 years if you combine both of the charges, if that's the jury and the judge's ultimate recommendation. So we'll see how that plays out, and our crew is going to set up outside to be ready for that information once it comes down the pike. If we can play some of this video here, just to have that ready for you. But again, going through a lot of emotions, a lot of testimony, a lot of information you've been hearing throughout just this morning. And it's been a fast-paced week. Our own legal analyst here at Wave News was not necessarily expecting the speed with which this would all be moving to get to this point for the jury to come to a unanimous decision, which if you know, in criminal trials for the state of Kentucky, you're discussing, it has to be a unanimous verdict from the 12 jurors, and the makeup of it can always vary, but all 12 have to agree. It's not the case in civil trials, but in a criminal trial like this one, you do need all 12 of them to agree on someone's innocence or guilt on the particular charge. So as we're playing some of this stuff out, I just want to go through some more interesting testimony we've been hearing throughout the day. So this morning, the first defense witness that was called up was Steve Lawson's mother. Her name is Barbara. And I'm just going to take you through the beats here that Barbara seemed to get particularly involved in all the discoveries ever since Crystal Rogers originally disappeared. But when Barbara took the stand, she discussed why certain witnesses, she wasn't sure why some were able to take the stand or be witnesses on behalf of the prosecution. There was a part where she talked about being angry and hurt about her son, Stephen, lying to her about his involvement in the case. So that was the testimony the jury heard, and that she said she had always told her sons to be honest with her. So even though she was a witness for the defense, at least a character witness, presumably, that was some of the testimony she gave to the jury. She goes on to talk about that jail phone call, which was the big bombshell from overnight, the last bit of evidence that the prosecution played for the jury to understand Stephen Lawson's role and implication in the charges and the investigation. And she was asked about that jail phone call. And if you were in the courtroom to listen to what Steve Lawson's mom said, she was trying to get to the truth. That is how she described her intent in that particular phone call with her son. So that puts you in a mindset of what she wanted to discuss. And she also talked about, she knew when this son, Steve Lawson, one of her sons, was lying. She described, at least to her best knowledge, how he would behave if and when he was lying about a particular conversation. So that was something to highlight for us as we've been following it with our reporting team in the courtroom. Because again, remember, we have not been able to have cameras inside. So we've just been relying on sketch artists and our notes and passing that information in written form to you once we're able to get our cameras and our microphones rolling. The perhaps surprise of the day when it comes to the things even our legal analysis team was not expecting was that Steve Lawson would take the stand in his own defense. And so he was the third witness in total for the defense to bring up. And to begin with, he was discussing his sort of fractured relationship with his son, Joseph, and he will come to court for his own separate trial later this coming. It's still May, so we'll talk about that when it comes in June. But that he still loved his son, even if their relationship was fractured. And going on to sort of elaborate on parts of the relationship, both of them with Brooks Houck. He said he'd met Brooks Houck through his son because he needed some work done on some property. And, you know, there's some friction at some point he was talking about, but they still seem to have a professional relationship at that point. And there was a mention about a farm where he and another witness and his son, he being Steve Lawson, were, you know, unfortunately they would go to drink and consume other substances. So that was sort of a sticking point that they would discuss in that, you know, what might affect his judgment or not. There was an argument also, Steve Lawson was discussing about Crystal Rogers' car and what would happen to it, where it was or wasn't taken. There's a phone call, he says, Joseph Lawson made to him, and that the car broke down on the Bluegrass Parkway, and they passed by to do a U-turn to try and take it somewhere else. And ultimately, Steve Lawson never denying, and his attorneys never denied either, that when he came in possession of the car, that they tampered with the seat to make it seem like Crystal Rogers was still the one using her own vehicle, the vehicle that she owned. So interesting layers for us there. Much more to discuss as we get into the latter part of the 4 o'clock hour. It is 4:53 right now. We're going to take a quick commercial break. We'll hope you stay with us as we continue to break down this breaking news update. Stephen Lawson found guilty on both the charges of conspiracy to commit murder and tampering with evidence in the disappearance of Crystal Rogers. We'll be right back. Thanks again for staying with us. We're coming to you live on Wave Now. That is our over-the-top platform and all of our social media feeds. Of course, you can always check in on wave3.com and Wave News as it's happening as we're closing down the hour. I'm Jose Sosaya. Thanks for staying with us on this extra in-depth coverage The breaking news that Stephen Lawson has been found guilty by a jury in Bowling Green on both criminal counts. We're talking tampering with evidence and conspiracy to commit murder in the disappearance of Crystal Rogers. As we wait for the next live report to come from our team there at the courthouse in Bowling Green, what happened? What was the timeline to get to this point? That is worth refreshing ourselves on. So I will play you part of our coverage, our Myra Ansari providing that timeline for us. So we're going to play that in a bit.
It all seemed odd from the beginning.
We're just trying to find her.
July 3rd, 2015 was the last day 35-year-old Crystal Rogers, a mother of 5, was seen alive by her boyfriend, Brooks Houck. 2 days later, she's reported missing by her parents. That same day, July 5th, Rogers' car is found along the Bluegrass Parkway with her things still inside.
Her purse was in there. Her cell phone was in there. Her keys was in the ignition. She don't ever leave her cell phone, ever. She would have not got out of that car and left her cell phone in that car.
People looked for clues. Police asked for help.
If Crystal can hear our voice, we love you. We want to know where you're at. Contact us. Let us know that you're okay.
Call it a parent's intuition. Sherry and Tommy Ballard knew whatever happened to their daughter was not good.
Just trying to hold it together.
Crystal's family was very vocal about their suspicion of her then boyfriend, Brooks Houck, having some sort of involvement in her disappearance.
I specifically told him that day, I think you did something to my daughter. I made that very clear.
The signs went up. The searches continued on land, by foot, four-wheelers, canines, and horses, and in water. And no shortage of prayers. July 8th, Brooks Houck was brought in by the Nelson County Sheriff's Office for questioning. Nick Houck, Brooks' brother and a Bardstown police officer, called mid-interview and told him not to speak with police.
If you're telling me to leave, I'll get up and leave.
July 9th, Houck spoke with Nancy Grace.
I'm 100% completely innocent in this.
That same month, Brooks Houck fails a polygraph test. In October, a big development from the Nelson County Sheriff.
I would label Brooks Houck a suspect, yes.
But he wasn't arrested, at least not yet. Crystal was presumed dead. Houck's brother, Nick, was fired from the Bardstown Police Department for interfering with the criminal investigation into the case.
That's just not how we do it as police officers.
In 2016, Houck's grandmother, Anna Whiteside's home is searched, along with the farm of Rosemary Houck, Brooke Houck's mother. There was a custody battle. Tommy and Sherry Ballard say that Brooks Houck stripped them of their privileges to see their grandson Eli after Crystal went missing. Then a turn of events that shocked everyone 16 months after Crystal disappeared.
We come out every day hoping we'll find something. We need closure.
In November of 2016, Crystal's father, Tommy Ballard, who had been investigating his daughter's disappearance, was shot and killed while hunting with his grandson on family property. Tommy's father, Till, spoke to us.
They were two good human beings, and they didn't deserve what they got. It's just hard to put it behind us. We'll never put it behind us. Tommy will always be there, and Chris. He wanted to find his daughter. That's all he wanted. And evidently he was getting too close to finding her. And it wasn't no deer hunter. They had to get rid of Tommy because he was finding out too much.
August 2018, the case captured national attention from NBC's Oxygen Network to the Today Show and Dr. Phil and others.
Did her boyfriend ever join in the search for her?
He never lifted a finger.
I believe someone wanted my husband out of the way.
August 2020, the FBI steps in and takes over the investigation. Over the year, there were searches at Brooks Houck's home, their family farm, Crystal's storage unit, including one in 2021, in the Woodlawn Springs subdivision, where Brooks Houck's construction company built several houses shortly after Rogers disappeared.
A lot of police presence in the backyards, cutting grass, using shovels, using chainsaws.
After a multi-day search, federal agents find an item of interest under a driveway.
You don't have any closure in her particular case.
And the fact that they're still investigating all this is incredibly encouraging.
In October of 2022, the FBI was back at Houck's 245-acre family farm. The FBI spent days combing through it and did confiscate an item there too. Then in January 2023, a special prosecutor is appointed to Crystal's case and to other high-profile Nelson County death investigations, including Roger's father. A big development months later in August, 32-year-old Joseph Lawson is arrested on 2 charges: conspiracy to commit murder and tampering with physical evidence. Then the arrest that many waited for more than 8 years.
This is a giant step in the answer about what happened to Crystal Rogers.
September 27th, 2023, the FBI arrests Brooks Houck.
Where's Crystal Rogers?
He is charged with murder and tampering with physical evidence.
I'm excited that now the whole world, especially Nelson County, knows that possibly, hopefully, justice has been and will be served.
In October, Houck is arraigned, and during the proceedings, the prosecution revealed they believe they are in possession of the firearm used to kill Tommy Ballard. And in December, a third man, Steve Lawson, is arrested and charged in the case. Steve Lawson is Joseph Lawson's father.
If I could get close to him, but it's the law hold me back. One thing I can say, because the son of a bitch don't need to be on this earth if he had anything to do with Crystal, and I know he did.
Headed into trial, we have items of interest from the FBI, a dead father, a missing daughter, and prosecutors say these 3 people know what happened to them. All 3 have pleaded not guilty.
Our thanks to Myra Ansari, of course, for that invaluable timeline that got us all to this point today. That breaking news against Stephen Lawson found guilty on all counts. And this just in, we just heard from our team reporting there in Bowling Green about the sentence that the jury is recommending for Stephen Lawson in this particular matter for the 2 charges, 17 years total. And when they say 17 years total, they're meaning for the conspiracy to commit murder charge, their recommendation, 17 years. And then the tampering with evidence part for his role in manipulating some evidence in Crystal Rogers' car when he took possession of it, a 5-year recommendation for that conviction and for those to run concurrent. So again, thanks for joining us on all of our platforms, Wave Now, our social media, if you're following us on wave3.com, and of course, much more extensive coverage throughout the night on Wave News itself. I'm Jose Sosaya, providing this extra in-depth coverage for you in this high-profile trial. Stephen Lawson, again, found guilty, 12 jurors agreeing on both of the charges, even though they had the option to. They were given to parse and make the distinction between conspiracy and facilitation, which facilitation is, in legal terms, a lesser degree for criminality there. But interesting how that all played out, as we now know that a jury ultimately found Stephen Lawson guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. So as we're following that breaking news in the disappearance of Crystal Rogers, the jury recommending, again, a 17-year sentence total. Lawson convicted on both the charges of conspiracy to commit murder and tampering with that physical evidence. Now, right now, you know, the jury, we're waiting to see that sentence, or we heard that sentence recommendation. Ultimately, we'll have to find out what is the last bit of business before the court closes today. We're waiting to see if we're able to talk to any folks who have been inside the courtroom, because again, remember, we could not bring cameras inside. So for anyone wanting to offer their insight, their reaction, whether or not they feel this is a sense of justice or relief for them, we will have to see once that comes up. The verdict came in just before 4 p.m. this afternoon. Heading into the conviction, the range for punishment for sentences for both of the crimes, we're told by our reporter Lena Noakes that the minimum was 10 years for tampering and 10 years for conspiracy. The maximum applies in both the charges, the same maximum possible amount, which is 25 years to prison when it comes to that. Now, for those of you who've been following this trial as closely as we have and following all of our in-depth coverage and analysis from our Wave legal analyst, Leland Hulbert, and all the reporting team down there in Bowling Green, before the jury actually left to go deliberate their recommendation for a sentence, they did hear from one of Crystal Rogers' children. That was her daughter, Tori. And Tori was 11 years old when her mom disappeared. She's now 21, grown up. She told the jury life without her mother has not been easy. It's still getting harder every day, is how she described it. Tori, however, said she's still holding out hope that they will find her mother someday. What that would entail, she didn't elaborate, but just the hope, the sheer hope that one day someone or something happens that they're able to find Crystal Rogers. Something else worth noting was Steve Lawson's mother in the sentencing phase. She also went out to the microphone to talk to the jury. She told the jury that she did not raise her son to be involved in, quote, something like this, meaning what is presumably that conspiracy prosecutors convinced the jury had happened to hurt and presumably disappear Crystal Rogers. Once the verdict was read, and again, we had our eyes and ears inside the courtroom for that pivotal moment. Crystal's mom, Sherry Ballard, Tori Rogers' grandmother, you could hear her crying in the courtroom based on our information from inside the courthouse. Our crew telling us the family and their contingent sitting there in the courtroom was clearly satisfied. That is how they described the reaction from the Ballard and Rogers gang there. We were seeing family members coming in and out of the hallway. We also saw well-wishers and supporters. In fact, I think we got a glimpse of this. We caught a glimpse of this through our own camera that I was able to show you as we were going live on Wave Now and our social media. Attell Ballard, that is Crystal's grandfather, Tori Rogers' great-grandfather. You could see him in tears leaving the specific courtroom where they've held this trial. Many people were actually wearing some shade of pink in their clothes as a way to honor Crystal and what she meant to them in their lives. So looking at more particulars and the stuff we've discovered from today, Steve Lawson, he admitted during trial that he helped move Crystal Rogers' car to the Bluegrass Parkway. And the part about tampering that the prosecution drove home and the defense never denied was that he moved the driver's seat up to make it appear that Crystal was the one and was the last one seen or known driving in her own car. He maintained and he denied that he had any involvement in her presumed murder. Hurdle for the prosecution heading into this was that they had never recovered Crystal's body, so that was just not the direct piece of evidence that they could have relied on from forensic analysis. But prosecutors still maintained their strategy. They used cell phone records to show that Steve Lawson was at Thompson Hill Farm on July 4th, the day right after, or the pivotal point is July 3rd and July 4th of 2015, that he was at that farm. And witnesses were testifying that they'd heard in some way, shape, or form in a passing discussion or a conversation that Steve Lawson discussed with each of the witnesses, or most of the witnesses, how Brooks Houck wanted to, quote, get rid of Crystal, presumably after some domestic friction or fight that they may have had. But there was still that repeated use of the phrase get rid of. And again, we're still waiting to hear what the last bit of business will be from the judge, what the ultimate sentence will be for Steve Lawson now that he has been found guilty. And we will bring that to you once we get it. So again, thanks for staying with us to follow this breaking news through our multiple platforms here on Wave Now, on all of our social media feeds. And of course, getting the latest updates on wave3.com and also on, of course, our ongoing coverage on Wave News TV. We'll take a quick break and bring you back the latest as we're able to get it from our team reporting down there in Bowling Green. So stay with us. All right, everyone, welcome back to Wave Extra. Jose Sosadia here on this platform. Thanks for connecting with us on our social media, on our Wave Now, and of course, all the different avenues we're providing you this in-depth, right now, nonstop coverage. The big breaking news, of course, this jury in Bowling Green finding Stephen Lawson guilty on both counts when it relates to the disappearance and presumed murder of Crystal Rogers. The jury recommending he serve a sentence of 17 years in prison. Here's a reminder of one of the many ways you can connect with us to follow the latest information, reactions, interviews, commentary is this blog. That's been a rolling blog on wave3.com. You can see just how extensive it goes throughout the timeline of the beginning of the trial up to this point. And the sketches putting you in the courtroom to see the faces of the prosecutors, the defense, all the witnesses we'd heard from both prosecutors and the defense, and just to put you as best as we can in the courtroom. Because again, remember, heading into this trial, there'd been so much attention and intrigue generated, not just within Wave Country, but from across the country, that a judge, had agreed with the sentiment that they did not want video cameras to distract from the possibility and the defendant's right to a fair trial. So that was part of the logic as to why we were not able to have a pool camera, at least inside the courtroom, to get those immediate reactions and information from those who took the stand and those who spoke to the jury. So just worth bearing that in mind as we welcome you back into our studio. Breaking news alert for this massive update coming from the jury in Bowling Green. And the earliest we presumed they would have come back to deliver their decision to the judge was 1:30. It did take them a little longer than that. They just come up with their decision by 4 o'clock. And so that is when they revealed, one, that they agreed with the prosecutors that Steve Lawson had tampered with evidence, but that was something the defense was never denying at the start of this case and throughout it. The one thing they were trying to poke holes in the prosecution's argument was when it related to a conspiracy to commit murder. So that was their approach. But in the end, 12 jurors agreed Steve Lawson played enough of a role that he bore the brunt and the responsibility of that particular criminal charge. So fascinating stuff right there as we play some more video for you. So to recap some of the stuff that stood out to us as the day went on, perhaps the surprise, if you talk to our legal analyst team and even from our reporters there in the courtroom in Bowling Green, no reason to have expected Steve Lawson to take the stand in his own defense, but he ultimately did. Based on the observations from the Wave News crew when he took the stand, he seemed pretty cool, calm, and collected. The defense trying to make the argument that they could humanize him to the jury. They had talked about his relationship with his son, Joseph Lawson. And remember, Joseph Lawson is tried with his own separate charges in this particular matter of Crystal Rogers disappearing. But Steve Lawson talked as a father would about a relationship with a troubled son, saying, quote, "I always love my son. I don't always like him, but I will always love him." Another element to this was perhaps Steve Lawson's confusion into one of the witnesses who did come up for the prosecution. Her name is Elizabeth Chesser, and she has a child with Steve Lawson's son, Joseph, but they had known each other as well through another family relationship. Steve Lawson never addressed those particular specifics, but he said he thought he and Elizabeth Chesser had a good relationship, so it was still a surprise that she would offer that testimony to the jury and to those in the courtroom. But a lot of it, again, hinging on a pivotal jail phone call that was the last bit of evidence the prosecutors played on Thursday. That was discussing Steve Lawson with his own mother about any implications that way. And there was a reiteration on some phone calls from July 15th with Steve Lawson. There was also discussions about, his apparent alcohol abuse and how that might have played a factor in his ability to do things or have the proper judgment. And the location with which they found him, for 4 hours around the timeline when Crystal disappeared was a farm where he knew the property owners, and he would go with several people to go drink what seemed like pretty massive amounts of alcohol based on the testimony. So that was just something that they tried. But the prosecution when it was their turn to talk to Steve to cross-examine, it was about with Brooks Houck's involvement. There was a question that he asked you to move the car, and you never asked why or where, pertaining to Brooks Houck and to Joseph Lawson, his son. Steve Lawson made it seem like he was not supposed to, and that he never did, and that he was trying to maintain that they have the wrong guy because, apparently, based on testimony, his interpretation was Brooks Houck wanted his then girlfriend, Crystal Rogers, gone. The quote that the prosecution used was he wanted her murdered, but Lawson replied, quote, "No, he didn't say that. I thought deceased. He did not say that." So again, you can imagine where this all falls into his recollection of that time in which it was still a very fresh realization that Crystal Rogers just was not around and she had disappeared. So you see where that was all playing into effect. The prosecutors, again, trying to remind the jury of the fact that Steve Lawson had lied in several past previous interviews with the FBI when they took over the investigation. So something worth reiterating, the prosecutors felt to the jury before they ultimately came to the conclusion they did. The defense, when it came time for their closing, saying the evidence was falling very short. That was a familiar repeated theme in much of their narrative. Evidence was falling short, quote, planning a murder is the most important part, the most important language, but honing in on the word planning. And the defense attorney is saying you did not hear that because that's not what happened. At least that was the claim they were making to the jury. They, being the prosecutors, they hadn't brought in something as evidence. It's not evidence. And that is where they repeated, they kept hammering home on this idea that there were untested hairs found in the car. There was no effort to test anything else. Right now, I'm going to take you to our live reporter, Alina Noakes, really quick with an update from inside the courtroom.
Obviously in tears, we saw them walking out the courthouse as well, hugging each other, still celebrating this guilty verdict today of a conspiracy to commit murder and tampering with evidence. The jury recommending 17 years total. That would be 17 years on the conspiracy charge and 5 years on tampering. They want them to run concurrently. So that would be a total of 17 years. Now, he should only serve about 85% of that sentence before he's parole eligible, and then he could also get credit for time served. I want to take you to, though, in the courtroom when the jury, before they broke to consider that sentence, what they were told to consider by the defense and the prosecution. A lot of heavy words here. That's probably the lightest way I can put it. We heard from two witnesses each, one on the defense side, one on the prosecution side. The defense putting up Barbara Coulter, that would be Steve Lawson's mom. She testified this morning before Steve Lawson took the stand himself, and she asked the jury for mercy in this case, okay? And we also heard from Tori Rogers, that's Crystal Rogers' daughter in this case, her asking the jury to really consider the loss that they have endured in the 10 years since Crystal Rogers has been missing. We're going to hopefully give you some more context as we come back later. Again, we're still waiting on attorneys to come out and hopefully be able to speak with us, Myra.
Our thanks again to our Alina Noakes reporting live there from Bowling Green with the latest, especially from that part of the sentencing testimony where you heard from Tori Rogers, Crystal Rogers' daughter, and her plea for the jury to find their sentencing recommendation. And to counter that, on the defense's side, Steve Lawson's mother, Barbara Coulter, to plead for mercy from the jury as far as what would be the end result and recommendation for Steve Lawson. So a lot to get through, a lot of different updates and, testimony and updates that are coming from that courtroom. We're trying to get those to you as soon as we can. We have our cameras pointed at any bit of information coming out of that particular courtroom in Bowling Green. Lots to go through, lots we can discuss. If we can, even say, the day is not done when it comes to the court business in this matter for Stephen Lawson. But again, a reminder, if you're just tuning in, jury finding Stephen Lawson guilty on 2 counts. One is tampering with evidence. The second being that conspiracy to commit murder for his apparent role in Crystal Rogers' disappearance. So much more to discuss. We will take a quick commercial break and be right back. All right, everyone. Thanks for sticking with us. It is 5:23 this Friday evening. I'm Jose Sosaya. We're providing you that continuing coverage right now. But again, the big breaking news that Crystal Rogers in this case and Stephen Lawson and his particular role, the jury found him guilty on both of those charges being conspiracy to commit murder and the tampering with evidence, as we've shown you images before. Really hinging on that piece of evidence for the prosecution was finding Crystal Rogers' car, and his defense really never disputing that he had tried to manipulate the car to make it seem like Crystal Rogers was the last person to have touched that. So I'm going to bring you back into studio, joined by our legal analyst, Leland Hulbert. And Leland, as you know, sometimes these things change, always trying to change the camera angle on the fly, but this is the business of live news. So appreciate you coming back in. Busy afternoon for you, to say the least, but we've been following this with, our eyes wide open. Talk to me about, any questions we've been bringing up with you throughout the day and just, different places we can go, because obviously our eyes are going to now look toward Joseph Lawson and Brooks Houck. But for the folks at home just tuning in who've, followed this as closely as we have, were there any things coming into this and coming out that seem pretty standard to you? And then what were perhaps the couple of things that you say, well, I've seen it play out a different way, and look at what happened this time?
Well, the biggest thing is what everybody will probably talk about is the defendant testifying. And you can second guess and say, well, that was a mistake. Well, you don't know. I mean, maybe the jury had already made up their minds. Maybe the defendant did fine and the closing argument really got to them, or maybe he didn't do well. So that's where we lose with the benefit of not having the video or audio from the trial. But the observations seem to suggest that as he was cross-examined pretty thoroughly, and to me, now we have a number, and sometimes that's a gauge. So the 17 years kind of tells me that the jury was less in favor of Stephen Lawson, because the human element of, well, maybe we liked Mr. Lawson, but we think he's guilty, so we'll give him 10 years, or we think he doesn't have much of a record, or we think that he deserves a guilty plea but a break. Well, they didn't do that. And they didn't meet in the middle at 15. They went to 17, which is higher. So it made me think that they didn't want to max him out at 20 or 25 with the tampering consecutive, but they did want to send a strong message with 17 years.
I wanted to ask you perhaps, because you helped put me in the mindset for juries when they ask questions and the things that they might have on their mind as they're given that opportunity to make those questions. There was a pattern, I think, just to see what his state of mind was, because there were some notes, if I'm trying to find them as best as I can here. There was a part where they were asking him how much he drank. And sometimes you wonder, you would put it in my head that the jury wants to get a sense of the characters, and you may not always anticipate what it is they're fixating on.
Mm-hmm.
But when you sort of think of that line of questioning, does that tell you anything? And, for the layperson at home, it might mean nothing, but what do you think a juror asking that kind of question says?
So are you saying the juror asked that question, or
the jury apparently had asked that question when Stephen Lawson, which again we were surprised
he normally drinks,
how much he had been drinking around that time?
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting question, and like I think I said yesterday, any question from a jury is a peek inside what they're actually thinking, and clearly they didn't think he was a choir boy, which I'm not sure anybody did. So if they're asking about his drinking habits, probably because he was at a bar and he went to a car and then went back to the bar. So maybe they were trying to see if he was going to claim, well, I had so much to drink, Brooks Houck or someone made me do this. I didn't know what I was doing, but he didn't go that route. So that could have been the reason for asking that. But every little bit goes to his character and his credibility. And just judging by the verdict and the number, it doesn't look like he did himself any favors by testifying. We don't really know that for sure, but that's what it appears.
Something I wanted to get your take on, as we've been getting a whole, barrage of texts just from our team down there in Bowling Green. You can imagine for our line of work, what we're hoping is to, get those human connections, reactions, the Ballard clan all there to hear the verdict. The intel we're getting is, they were visibly, physically relieved to hear what had happened. There was a note that came in that says, it seems perhaps an attorney or someone in their corner would advise them not to speak before we finish this circle, perhaps
Right.
because Brooks Houck's trial and Joseph Lawson's trials are still pending. You as an attorney, I imagine it would make sense that, they might have so much to say, but perhaps now is still not the best time, even if visibly we could see what this meant to them.
As a prosecutor, you probably want them talking. You want their story out there, that you want their human element. And as victims, they just had a pin pulled out of the balloon. I mean, they've been holding this in for 10 years with no relief, no justice, and no answers. And they're not going to be happy now, but they may be more satisfied. They may feel like they've finally gotten some justice, because 10 years is extreme. Normally a murder case, you're looking at a year or two, but 10 years is a lot for a family, and especially they still don't have a body. They may never know exactly what happened. So it's just relief, and they deserve to be heard. And, their reactions, I mean, in my experience, the reactions of victims' family will be played on the news more than anything a lawyer says or an analyst says or anything like that. That's where the real human element is. And that will probably resonate with potential jurors in Warren County that are watching this on TV. So getting that out there is probably better for the prosecution. But at the end of the day, this is just a family who's exhaling.
And, obviously still visibly heartbroken. I wanted to show you some notes here where it comes to the notes we're able to get from the defense's closings and the prosecutor closings. So, the point to make sometimes, do you want to find those emotional connection points and building that narrative with the jury as much as possible? Because, it's some, pretty strong choice of language and some quotes we're able to pull here. And so, but again, you've walked us through the process where it's not necessarily a surprise, the defense poking holes as best as they can. So they say, the evidence falling short, reiterating that, for as much as they would like to do these things, they've never found Crystal Rogers' body. They never tested certain hairs or DNA from the car. There was even something brought up about investigation not being finished because there was a mention of a social security check that might have hinted at fraud, but why didn't you pursue that lead? And so the defense coming from that perspective, I don't know if I should be so fixated just on, that's a pretty strong metaphor, but you might know the prosecutor we're discussing here where he was equating Steve Lawson to Judas. So that's a biblical metaphor for
right.
the drywall contract. Does that surprise you at all in the language you're using to describe these things?
No, because first of all, the prosecutor is extremely skilled. I think I said it before. He's probably one of the best prosecutors Kentucky's ever had. He was a federal prosecutor for a long time. I worked with him at the prosecutor's office. He knows how to speak to a jury in terms they can understand and also be very convincing. And comparing Lawson to Judas is an interesting comparison because he's given so many statements that have been inconsistent, and it's something the jurors identify with, and it's making it sound important. And that's his job, to make it the jurors care about this case, to care about Crystal Rogers, to care about this is serious enough to find him guilty. This is not something you just want to waffle on and be like, well, maybe he's guilty, maybe he's not. The prosecution has to be strong in their position, or the jury certainly will not be.
So, and it just certainly was startling to think that, but it makes sense in him trying to really drive home that point of the connection points. And, a question I didn't get to ask you as we're now discussing and waiting to hear what else we hear from the court today before they wrap up with Stephen Lawson's matter for the day. I don't know what the particulars or what the order of operations has to be for this to happen. What do you see happening or preluding to Stephen Lawson ever taking the stand once Joseph Lawson and Brooks Houck's trials start?
Well, Stephen Lawson is not likely to do that, but he'd have to have an incentive. I mean, he's looking at 17 years in prison, so his incentive would be lowering that sentence. And if the prosecution wants to make that deal with a person who's flip-flopped and is now a convicted felon and is now convicted of murder. They can do that, but that's a risk because the defense would light him up because of all this. But presumably, if you believe the jury's verdict and the way the story went, he knows a lot. So he has held things back in the future because he was hesitant. Well, now he has a reason to tell it all. And the question is, will he tell the truth? So it seems more like a movie that, oh, he'll come in for the second trial and testify and he'll go after the other two. But one of the people is his son. And even if they're a little bit estranged, you typically wouldn't see a father testify against his son. And he doesn't really have any incentive to testify. So he also has a reason now that he would maybe want an incentive because he's stuck going to prison. So I don't think it will happen. I think it's technically possible, but the prosecution is buoyed by this, and they're probably feeling pretty good about the way the evidence came in and obviously the verdict. So do they need him? No. Would he help? Maybe, maybe not. Is it worth reducing the sentence of someone you've worked so hard to convict? Probably not.
And to your point that, a defense, you're not necessarily overlapping on defense counsel for a father and a son in a separate trial. And therefore, Joseph's defense counsel would fight pretty doggedly to, poke a hole in saying, like, the reason you're discussing all this in this hypothetical is we presume you were given some kind of deal to lessen your prison sentence. And a jury could read that as saying, like, should I trust that particular bit of testimony, right?
Yeah, and they would attack him. They'd call him a snitch. They'd talk, he's lied before, you're lying now. The typical tactics a defense attorney would use to weaken him. But at the end of the day, presumably he has knowledge about what happened, and only a few people do. So his statements are recorded, and he is obviously alive, and he could testify, but I don't think it's likely they'll bring him in. But this trial has been unlikely in some ways, with the speed of it and, predicting how it's going to go. I've been wrong on a number of predictions because it's not going the way a typical high profile murder case would go. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, it's just going faster. And that's just the way it's been. And I expect the second one to be similar with the same judge.
Call it unconventional, or I was going to say they call it unconventional to say the least, right?
Right. It's still going through the trial process. It's just going in a much more expedient manner. Now, second one, I think I told Myra this. The second one, I don't know if it will go as fast because you've got a jury pool that knows about this more than they would have before because it's in Bowling Green again. And you have two defendants. So every time a witness is up there for the prosecution, you're going to have the prosecution talk to them. You're going to have one set of attorneys talk to them and another set of attorneys talk to them, and then cross-examine, and back and recross and redirect. So theoretically, the second trial should be much longer. How much longer, I don't know.
We'll have to find out. Leland, while you're here, we're going to bring in Alina Noakes. I'm going to see if we can bring her up. And just checking in, Alina, if she can hear us. We do have Leland here in studio. I'll wait for her head nod to confirm that, or a yes from Alina. Yes, we can. Okay. Leland, you're more than welcome to ask Alina some questions while she's there. If you'd like, the floor is yours. And she did want to chat with you about all the coverage.
Yeah, and I'm happy to answer any questions. I'm just curious if you thought the jury was responding well to the closing arguments of defense or prosecution, or both.
Well, when looking at the closing arguments as the case closed, not the sentencing recommendation, I actually was kind of surprised with what they came back with. I did note that a lot of jurors during the defense, I don't say a lot, I should say a few in this case, one specifically that I was really eyeing the whole time from who I could see, were really responding to some of the defense comments. Mainly the one where we've obviously had this question of what really happened to Crystal Rogers. Obviously, she's presumed dead. No one's heard from her in nearly 10 years. But there are still a lot of questions about, well, what exactly happened? And in this case, the defense argues that you can't prove conspiracy if there was no murder proved at this point. The prosecution saying that they didn't have to prove murder in this case. But the defense really trying to pinpoint that for the jury, and some jurors seem to be kind of reacting to the comments about, we still haven't heard about those untested hairs. Why didn't they test the hairs? We still haven't heard much about the IRS tax returns. What about those? The things that have been brought up as questions around, you know, the holes in the evidence here, or the gaps as they called it. These sort of things really did, I think, hit with the jury, but I don't know in what way. I could just see it kind of register on their faces, some head nods going along with that. And I don't know if some of the alternates in this case had similar thoughts and if that impacted how this jury played out. But it seemed like they were really invested in what the defense had to say, which took me a bit by surprise, just how emotive they were being on the jury, in the jury box. So I think that's where I took it. Obviously, though, you can tell by the verdict in this case that they really believe what the prosecution put up this week.
Alina, really quick, I was discussing with Leland, since you had let us know that we'd found out the Ballard clan, Sherry Ballard and her family, they mentioned that they were wanting to hold off discussing anything with you all until we get to perhaps presumably the last chapter of this, which would be Brooks Houck and Joseph Lawson's trial. Leland explaining to us, you know, a prosecutor might want the benefit for that human connection. The defense is going to feel differently about that. In all the time you've been covering this, did that ever come as a surprise to you, that for as much as we saw them just release this emotion and its satisfaction, not really feeling like justice, but that they would want to, for as much as they'd like to say, they think there's a better time to do this?
Yeah, I don't want to say it surprised me, really. Obviously, the Ballard family over the last nearly 10 years being very, very vocal about Crystal's disappearance and the investigation, and really pushing for change, pushing for answers. Obviously, that got them pretty far, as we are now in the middle of two trials now, one with a guilty verdict. So I don't want to say it really took me by surprise. Obviously, when you're dealing with trials, and Sherry Ballard in this case testifying as the very first witness for the prosecution, it's very clear why they may not want to talk. And in talking to some family members just casually and not with any cameras around, they do remark, obviously, the prosecution wanting to kind of keep them off the screen until later. So they've made the suggestion after the next trial they maybe would want to talk, but I think they're just holding out right now until they see the conclusion of this case as it currently stands.
Understood, Alina. We'll bring it back. If Leland had a question for you while you're still out there, we're waiting for more developments from there. Leland, if you wanted to ask Alina anything while she was out there.
So I was curious, did you notice at any time where the defense team pointed fingers at Brooks Houck, or did they pretty much just try to stay as removed from everything as possible?
That is a really interesting question. Actually, no, they didn't really point fingers at Brooks Houck. In fact, in their closing especially, really emphasizing that we don't even know if she's dead. We don't know if there is a death. Steve Lawson making the same suggestion in his testimony on the stand today. So they didn't really try to point back to Brooks Houck at all during their case. So that was a thing to note as well. They did, however, try to place blame elsewhere, say with Rosemary Houck and Nick Houck and their potential involvement, and why that wasn't something that was being brought up here. In their case, in the defense side, trying to make a suggestion that there's some other suspect out there, obviously bringing in the untested hairs and the DNA expert in this case who testified on their behalf. But the prosecution didn't really play with that at all. They kind of fed right into it, calling Nick and Rosemary Houck, who are not indicted in this case, unindicted co-conspirators. So not really bringing up Brooks Houck or Joseph Lawson all that much, aside from the direct tie to Steve Lawson and the comments that have been made and the actions and admissions that he's made so far.
Alina, really quick, since we wish we had some extra cables for Leland, but if you had a question for him, I will send it back. I can hear you, and I will feed the question to Leland so he can answer, and we'll let you know, okay? Because you can hear him for sure. So go ahead.
Yeah, my question for you, Leland, that's been on my mind, honestly, this entire trial. I was wondering how the conspiracy charge would come out, considering this is one of those cases where there is no body. And that's so very rare to get a guilty verdict on murder charges like this or anything associated with murder charges. Do you think that that's going to have more bearing in the Brooks Houck trial than potentially it did here, where the prosecution made it very clear when they started this case, we're not trying to prove murder and we don't have to do that, but it's going to be a little bit of a different, burden of proof in the Brooks Houck's case, I would assume. What are your thoughts?
For sure. And I'll bring that question to Leland as I'll surmise it as best as I can, Leland. Alina's basically asking, it was interesting to her about conspiracy because there was no body. And sometimes you and I discussed that such a hurdle to climb. It's not insurmountable, but it's still a hurdle. Do you think that will bear any more, that'll play an even more important role when it comes time to Joseph Lawson and Brooks Houck's trial, that even the jury, understanding there's no body as direct evidence, they still felt this way with Stephen Lawson, that when it comes time to weigh the evidence against Joseph and Brooks Houck, that with conspiracy, but still not having a body, where do you see that bearing or playing an influence or a factor? And I'll turn that off for you there. Yes.
Yeah, I think it's you're going to see the same thing that you saw here. I think it would be naive for anyone to say, well, no body, no verdict, no verdict of guilty, because clearly they just found a guilty verdict. So the body is an obstacle, but clearly the people were either in cahoots or there was some sort of involvement by more than one person. And that's how you kind of start a conspiracy. Did they have proof that they sat down in what room they sat down in and wrote down their plans? No, of course not, because that's not the way they work. But it seems like the jury, to find Stephen Lawson guilty of the conspiracy to murder, he clearly thought they were working together in some capacity and they were moving chess pieces for each other, because the whole moving of a car of a missing person or deceased person and doing that at the behest of someone else would suggest that that someone else is either involved in the murder or involved in the planning, committed the murder. I mean, I don't think that's too far of a leap. Now, the problem is, I think a lot of people will also assume that, well, guilty this time, it'll be guilty next time. I mean, it's a whole new jury, and you never know what's going to happen. You have different set of defense attorneys. You could have pointing the finger. When you try two defendants sitting next to each other, sometimes they'll point the finger at each other, and a jury can get focused in different directions. So the strategy will overlap, but they will be different for the second trial. And I think the second trial, you're probably going to see a longer trial, and you're going to see some different things. I don't think it's going to be a carbon copy.
Fair enough. Alina, before we let you go, because I know you'll be busy with more of our ongoing coverage with, of course, Wave News at 6 is coming up in about 14 minutes. Before I let you go, any reason to believe we won't have the same or even more interest for people wanting to come into a courtroom when the time comes to start Joseph Lawson and Brooks Houck's respective trials?
I'm unsure, mainly because I think the interest has always been there. People very closely following this case, no matter what publication they read, what news station they potentially watch. But the thing that is interesting is kind of like, does it draw more interest with Brooks Houck and Joseph Lawson? Obviously Brooks Houck being the main suspect for so long, probably. But I don't necessarily know if that would increase, publicity in Warren County here in terms of people who are coming to the courthouse and investing in the case in that way. We did see the family had asked for respect before this trial for people to, there's limited space in the courtroom. Let's please stay home. We'll keep you informed about what the outcome and ongoing nature of the case is. And I think people really, especially in Bardstown, Nelson County, took that to heart. So, I don't know. At this point, it's kind of an unseen thing.
we'll certainly have to find out, and we'll figure that out when the time comes. And maybe your eyes letting us know that for a fact, or the rest of our team as those trials begin. We're going to let you go, Alina. Thank you so much. Alina Noakes reporting live for us in Bowling Green. You can catch her with much more updates at 6 o'clock. Wave News at 6. Alina, thank you. All right, bringing it back into us. Thanks for joining us again. Wave Extra, Jose Sosaya, Leland Hulber joining us. Leland, Alina talking about, that intrigue in Nelson County, Bardstown hasn't changed. Of course, that's the community where all this played out in the timeline where it all did. The reason that this brought us down to Warren County, where you're trying to find a jury that hasn't, been so exposed, as might be the word, or just that they would not be as naturally inclined to have an opinion about that case as someone in Nelson County might have, given all the attention so many people have been doing and following with this coverage. Is there a challenge now to find a jury pool for these next trials, that you could find enough people that you feel like you can form a fair trial for the defendants?
Certainly. There's been plenty of high-profile cases, and 98% of the time they're tried in their home county. And there's a lot of buildup, and there's a lot of press, and there's a lot of preconceived notions. So you're not going to typically find jurors that don't know anything about a trial. The goal is to find jurors that are not biased and are not bringing their biases in, and they don't know more than the average person. And sometimes you get uninformed jurors, because if you ask the question and 20 people raise their hand that, yes, I know this, yes, I've watched this, yes, I've formed an opinion, is kind of the $1 million question, because if they have, they're out. There's no way a judge would seat them. But most people will say they have not formed an opinion, whether they have or haven't. But I think what you're asking is how are they going to pick a jury, and will it be different? And I think it will be. I think there has to be more awareness now that there's a conviction. And does that mean they can't be impartial? No. And does that mean these next two will be found guilty? No. But I do think it'll be a little more tricky, and perhaps a little longer, choosing a jury to find 12 people that don't have any preconceived notions about this case.
Does that merit for someone, if you were defense counsel for either of these men, moving the venue at all? I don't know. It would feel like quite a leap to do it in such a short, compressed timeline. But is that something, if you were their defense counsel, to say we need to find a different county, a different venue?
I think they could make that argument. I mean, I can't predict what the defense is thinking. I think they're probably ready to go. But let's say they don't like what happened today, and now they want to delay. That's something they would probably throw in there to say, oh, well, there's too much media coverage now. This is everywhere. But it's been like that for a long time. So I don't think the judge would listen to that part of their argument. They could have other arguments. There could be evidentiary arguments. There could be complications with Stephen Lawson now, who is someone who's given so many statements and evidence. But I would, if I'm a betting man, I would bet the trial will go on as planned, June 24th, because this judge seems to be pushing things forward and trying to get it done.
Okay, excellent. It is 5:51. Thanks again for sticking with us. Wave Now, Wave Extra, all of our social media platforms, and a huge shout out, thank you to Leland for walking us through the ins and outs, intricacies of this all. Obviously, when the time will come, Leland, for the next high-profile cases to discuss, and Stephen Lawson's relationship, the consequences of this conviction, and then what that plays out for the other upcoming trials with Joseph Lawson and with Brooks Hauk. We're going to take a quick commercial break, and we'll be right back. Thanks for sticking with us. All right, welcome in everyone again. Thanks. Thank you for sticking with us. We're coming up on 5:54. Still rolling with you on all our different Wave social feeds on our Wave Now platform. And if you're following any of the updates, of course, you can download the free Wave News app and all of our different, update platforms on apps, Apple, iMac, Android, the list goes on and on. Needless to say, thank you for joining us as we continue bringing you round the clock on this afternoon, this Friday evening, breaking news coverage. The big news coming out of Bowling Green from this afternoon that a jury of 12 people in Bowling Green found Stephen Lawson guilty on 2 counts. Those 2 counts being tampering with evidence and conspiracy to commit murder when it comes to the disappearance and presumed murder of Crystal Rogers, Bardstown Mama 5 back in 2015. So to recap, in essence, what's gone on through the day. It's been nearly 10 years, if you can believe, since that time that Crystal Rogers disappeared from Bardstown. The sense from our reporting team out there in the courtroom that they've been there this entire week, that the family feels like there's finally some sense of justice, perhaps some relief, not fully all the way there. Stephen Lawson, by the way, is the first man in a trio to face that trial in connection to her presumed death, the jury finding her guilty. The other 2 men, if you've been following along, are Stephen's son, Joseph Lawson, and Crystal Rogers' then boyfriend at the moment she disappeared, Brooks Houck. And there's multiple layers and in relationships worth mentioning there. So the case, needless to say, capturing national attention. You can imagine thousands upon thousands of people asking the big picture question is, where is Crystal Rogers? What happened to her? Only a select number of people can answer that question. And investigators, and prosecutors saying, unfortunately, we still don't know what happened to her because no one's been able to uncover, where she might be. So worth mentioning that. But it's been 4 days of testimony in Bowling Green. Moved out of Bardstown, Nelson County to find a more impartial jury. After all these days, a jury thinking there was enough to convict Stephen Lawson of conspiring to murder Crystal Rogers and also the tampering with evidence. That's something that his own defense counsel was never disputing, that he moved her car to the Bluegrass Parkway, scooting up a seat to make it seem like she was the last one to have ever driven that particular car. So, fascinating testimony to have played out throughout this particular week as we're moving through, again, breaking news coverage. What I want to give you now is some sense of what the defense and the prosecution had to say in their own closing arguments, their own final pitch to the jury to make the case either for or against Stephen Lawson's innocence of the defense. In fact, a surprise tactic, even our own legal analyst wasn't entirely expecting, was having called Stephen Lawson to the stand. And so there was opening him up for cross-examination. But to recap where the defense was going with this, trying to drive the point home to the jury that the evidence in theory was falling short, that there were still some things prosecutors had not delivered on to present, paint a clear-cut picture about Steve Lawson's role in physically what happened to Crystal Rogers, and sort of really circling, highlighting the word planning a murder. Quote, that's the most important part, the most important language. And you didn't hear the word planning. They were making the case because that's not what happened. And the defense, in their time trying to poke holes in the prosecution's argument, reiterating if they, meaning police, investigators from local in Bardstown and then going further up into the FBI when they got involved, but in saying if they didn't bring something as evidence that you could not then consider anything, it's not evidence. Essentially, the fact that Steve Lawson came up to the stand, they were trying to make the sense that, this was Steve Lawson being honest, giving a heartfelt rendition of what had happened, and that ultimately a big point that we weren't sure how big of a hurdle it would have been for the prosecution to clear was the fact that there's no proof of a murder specifically, because there was no body. Crystal Rogers' body still hasn't been found all these years later. And then perhaps the agreement to commit a murder, they would imply you needed to have committed murder first with proof of, unfortunately, someone's body or corpse. Then came time for the prosecutors to have the final word in their closing arguments. And this is someone who our own Wave legal analyst, Leland Holbert, says is one of Kentucky's most most awarded, lauded prosecutors with decades of experience and credibility to his name, but using some pretty strong language for the jury to really take the point home that he, being Steve Lawson, knew what the plan was, and the plan was to kill the young lady in reference being Crystal Rogers, and that Steve knew that and still chose to play a role in what it carried out. Going on to say, and trying to make the case that Steve Lawson lied to cover up what was his, quote, fundamental role in this conspiracy to kill Crystal, end quote. And another strong metaphor, perhaps, that the prosecutor equating Stephen Lawson to Judas. If you remember, there's a bit of testimony about him and Brooks Houck in a professional capacity setting up a sort of a relationship that if, Steve Lawson had done this favor for Houck, and because Houck was involved in construction and contracting work in that way, that then Stephen Lawson would have access to drywall work through any of those different opportunities for development. And, the metaphor stuck in calling him a Judas, quote, that was his 30 pieces of silver. So some pretty strong language from the prosecution in that regard. And you could see the jury believed there was enough evidence based on the testimony and what we heard from Steve Lawson that he was found guilty on both of these charges. I want to see if we can toss now to our Alina Noakes reporting live in Bowling Green.
Quickly after the guilty verdicts, obviously you guys said guilty on conspiracy and guilty as well on tampering with physical evidence. I do want to emphasize they recommended 17 years, which is not the maximum as requested by the prosecution. Prosecution asked for a total of 25 years. The defense asking for the minimum of 10 years. The jury kind of split the difference and went with 17 years. That was a little bit of a surprise to us considering they did return a guilty verdict. So you've got to think that potentially the closing arguments on sentencing recommendations really did play an impact in how the jury felt about the sentence. The defense did put up his mother, Steve Lawson's mother, Barbara Coulter, who we heard from both today in the defense's case on this, testifying for them, as well as Crystal Rogers' daughter, Tori Rogers. She gave emotional testimony as well in that sentencing recommendation phase. So again, the jury splitting the difference there on 17 years. He would serve 85% before he's eligible for parole. And then he would also have credit for time served. We expect him to be sentenced on August 6th at 3 p.m. in Nelson County, at the Nelson County Circuit Court.
All right, thanks to Alina Noakes reporting live there in Bowling Green. Really, it's been a work to keep track of all the different characters and testimony we've been hearing throughout the 4 days of testimony, bits of evidence, and ultimately now the jury coming to its conclusion on a verdict for both counts and their recommendation for 17 years to be served concurrently. And so again, that would be 17 years for the conspiracy charge, 5 years for the tampering with evidence, but those would be running concurrent. So we're still waiting to see what Alina is able to provide as far as the latest updates from there. Let's see if we can listen in really quick.
Anticipated. We had a jury seated by 12:30 on the first day, on Tuesday of this trial. So jury selection went fairly quickly with this first trial. We did see a number of hands during jury selection in the first round of 37 jurors who raised their hands saying that they knew something about this case and had formed an opinion. But as they kept making the rounds and weeding people out, that really diminished as to how often they saw people who knew anything about the case. So as far as that goes with jury selection, we did get a jury fairly quickly in this trial. Now, I have been, like you said, staying here all week, and we are fairly close to the courthouse. So a lot of the people we've been staying with at, say, the hotels and eating with in the restaurants are all people who've been actively participating in this trial, whether they're in the audience or even called as witnesses or sitting at the prosecution and defense tables. But we have seen people in some places, some establishments we've gone to, watching coverage on the phones, looking through social media and seeing things, late afternoon coverage and late evening coverage, and the things that a number of, say, Louisville stations have been putting up about this case. So definitely, it's going to be interesting to see if it plays a factor in the upcoming trial of Brooks Houck and Joseph Lawson.
And again, our thanks to Alina Noakes reporting for us. As she said, she's been there all week down in Bowling Green, covering the ins and outs, the different connections, twists and turns when it comes to relationships and all the people involved, and coming from Bardstown when it comes to Steve Lawson, Joseph Lawson, and Brooks Hauk. Let's see if we can get her back.
Asking the jury to return no mercy in this case, saying that Steve Lawson had every opportunity to come forward and tell people about this over the last 10 years and his role in this, and asking them to not return any mercy. But that was coming after what we heard in emotional testimony from, like I said, Tori Rogers, who's Crystal Rogers' daughter. She was 11 years old when her mother disappeared. She's 21 now. She's going to be married soon. And she just talked about the grief this family has felt. The prosecutor asked her, have you ever given up hope, and when did that happen in the search for your mother? She says, we have not given up hope. We believe we will find Crystal, or her mom in this case, but it may not be in the way that we would like to. So I think the family's still holding out hope that they're going to find Crystal. But of course, every step is a step towards some closure in this case, some comfort, but without that missing piece, you can't say that it's ever going to be fully there.
You heard Arlena Noakes reporting there again, just different bits of insight as we move forward to see what happens next with upcoming trials, because we're going to be paying very close attention, providing you the same in-depth coverage when it's time to bring Stephen Lawson's son, Joseph, into the courtroom, and Brooks Hauk, perhaps the most high-profile name, the most talked-about name in regards to the Crystal Rogers case. You've followed all our in-depth reporting, the timeline and previews leading up to Stephen Lawson's own trial, but just establishing the pattern, the decisions, the investigation about Brooks Hauk, Crystal Rogers' then boyfriend, and how Crystal's family has felt throughout this whole process about perhaps what they've described as his unwillingness to join them in the search for Crystal, him maintaining his innocence about where she might be and when and how she might have disappeared, but two competing, conflicting perspectives on what essentially happened to Crystal that night on July 3rd of 2015. So again, much more coverage as you stick around with us. You can always follow for more updates, not just on this avenue on Wave Now and all of our social media platforms. We're providing you the latest information. I'm going to pull it up so you can see some refreshes right now on our website, wave.com. You can click the homepage there and take you back to this running blog, which is just a sort of long list, narrative of everything we've been hearing when it comes to the beginning of the trial, jury selection, the prosecutors involved, the defense attorneys involved, which, mind you, they argued they came into this process relatively quickly, since Steve Lawson at some point had decided to no longer have his previous counsel represent him in this particular matter. So that was a wrinkle with some appeals and some motions heading into this trial. But again, a long list of all the different sketches. Our thanks to our sketch artist, Sydney Young, for providing these vignettes of the different witnesses and their expressions from inside the courtroom, and the different people asking questions, delivering answers. Just vital information there from her. So we thank her for that. Coming back in here, we're going to take a very quick commercial break, see if we have any more updates for you as we again follow this pretty massive breaking news on jury convicting Stephen Lawson of those 2 counts of tampering with evidence and conspiracy to commit murder against Crystal Rogers. So we'll take a quick break and we'll be right back. Thanks again, folks, for sticking with us here on Wave Now, this Wave Extra segment on our Wave Now platform and our social media. Jose Sosaya, I've been with you since 4:06 this afternoon when we got that breaking update from our crew in Bowling Green that a jury of 12 found Stephen Lawson guilty of both counts as it relates to his role in that night that Crystal Rogers disappeared in Bardstown. So much more to get to. Just want to let you all know we're going to wrap up this particular segment. But don't worry, we'll have many more updates. A live report coming up later tonight at 7 on Wave News. I'll be part of the team providing much more in-depth coverage on Wave News at 11. All sorts of updates, interviews, reaction. You can find that on our multiple social media platforms as well as wave3.com. Needless to say, with this chapter, with the decision, the verdict, the sentencing recommendation for Stephen Lawson, we'll have much more anticipation when it comes time to really sink into what happens in Joseph Lawson's trial and Brooks Houck's trial in particular. So just know that we will be there when the time comes, no matter if we have access to a pool camera to bring you those images live or bring you those images period or not, but we will be there with a team providing notes and information so that you know exactly what is going on if you're interested and want to know what a jury makes of all of that. So thank you all for tuning in, sticking around with us. Like I said, we will have much more. Tune into Wave News at 7 for our latest live reports and updates from Alina. And we're going to have much more tonight as we head into the weekend on Wave News at 11. Thank you.